The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was gray and still. The next, thick black clouds rolled in from the mountains and swallowed the last light of the evening. Rain fell hard and fast. Thunder shook the ground. Lightning split the sky into jagged white pieces and disappeared just as quickly. Harold pulled his coat tighter and ran to close the barn doors. He was a simple man. He had a small farm at the edge of a wide forest, far from the nearest village. He grew vegetables, kept a few chickens, and lived alone in a stone house that had belonged to his father before him. He did not have much. But he did not need much either. He latched the barn doors shut, checked on his 2 chickens, and made sure the roof was not leaking again above the feed corner. Satisfied, he turned to head back to his house. That was when he heard it. It was not thunder. Thunder was sharp and loud and gone in a second. This sound was low and slow and heavy. It came from the far side of the barn, beyond the wooden fence where the old apple tree stood. It was a sound like something enormous had fallen from a great height and hit the ground with all its weight. Harold stood still for a moment. The rain hammered the barn roof. Lightning flashed again. He picked up the lantern hanging by the barn door and walked toward the sound. He rounded the corner of the barn and stopped. At first he could not understand what he was seeing. In the flickering light of his lantern, all he saw was a huge dark shape on the ground. It was bigger than his barn. Bigger than anything he had ever seen resting on flat earth. It had a long neck that lay stretched across the mud. A broad body that rose and fell with slow, labored breathing. And wings, 2 enormous wings, spread out on either side like the sails of a ship that had been torn apart by a terrible wind. They were wings made of dark leather and long black feathers, and they were badly damaged. Several feathers were broken or missing. The membrane between the bones was torn in places. One wing was bent at an angle that made Harold wince just looking at it. The creature was alive. But only just. Harold lifted his lantern higher. He could see wounds along the creature's sides, deep cuts that had dried into dark crusts. He could see the way its ribs moved with great effort every time it tried to breathe. Its massive head lay on the ground with its eyes half open, and those eyes, they were large and gold and very old-looking, turned slowly toward the lantern light. Toward Harold. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Harold knew he should feel afraid. Any sensible person would feel afraid. The creature was enormous. Its claws were half buried in the mud and each one was longer than Harold's arm. Its teeth, just barely visible behind its slightly open mouth, were the size of daggers. It was clearly a predator. Clearly something that, in full health, could destroy his entire farm without effort. But Harold looked at it and did not feel fear. He felt something else entirely. He felt the way he had felt years ago when he found a young fox caught in an old trap near the forest edge, terrified, shaking, bleeding. The fox had snapped at him when he came close. But he had not walked away. He had stayed low and slow and quiet until the fox stopped snapping. Then he had freed it, wrapped its leg, and kept it in his barn until it could walk again. He looked at the creature now the way he had looked at that fox then. It was suffering. That was the only thing that mattered. He set the lantern down on the fence post and went back into the barn. He came out with a large bucket which he filled from the rainwater barrel near the wall. He carried it carefully around to where the creature lay and set it down near its head. The creature's golden eyes followed him the whole time. Slow. Watchful. Too weak to do anything but watch. Harold stepped close, closer than any person with sense would step to a creature like this, and gently pushed the bucket toward its mouth. The creature stared at him. Then, very slowly, it lowered its great head toward the bucket and drank. Harold let out a quiet breath. He went back inside and came out with a second bucket, this one filled with the leftover stew he had made for his own supper, thick with potatoes and turnips and a few pieces of salted pork. He had planned to eat it over 2 days. He set the whole bucket down in front of the creature without hesitation. The creature ate. Slowly. Without lifting its head very far from the ground. Harold watched it for a moment, then turned and went to the barn again. He came out with the 3 heaviest blankets he owned, the wool ones he kept for the coldest nights of winter. He could not cover the whole creature. It was far too large for that. But he spread the blankets across the creature's neck and the upper part of its body, tucking the edges into the mud to keep them from blowing away in the wind. The rain was still falling. The wind was cold. Harold stood back and looked at the creature. Its breathing was still slow and difficult. Its wounds were not going to heal in a single night. But it was no longer shaking the way it had been when he first found it. Its eyes were a little more open now, the gold in them catching the lantern light. It was looking at him. Not with hunger. Not with warning. With something Harold could not name, something deep and steady and very, very old. Harold picked up his lantern from the fence post. "You rest," he said quietly. "Storm will pass by morning." He did not know if the creature could understand him. He said it anyway. Then he walked back to his stone house, hung his wet coat by the door, and sat down by the fire. He did not sleep well that night. Not because he was afraid. But because he kept thinking about those golden eyes, the way they had watched him bring the water, the food, the blankets. The way they had not looked away from him once. Outside, the storm slowly began to quiet. And the great winged creature lay still in the mud beside Harold's barn, breathing, slowly, painfully, but steadily, through the long dark night. The storm was gone by morning. Harold woke before sunrise the way he always did. He put on his boots, splashed cold water on his face, and opened his front door. The air was clean and cold after the heavy rain. Puddles sat in every low spot in the yard. The apple tree had lost several branches in the wind. He walked around to the side of the barn. The creature was still there. He had half expected it to be gone. He had half expected to find nothing but flattened mud and the memory of those golden eyes. But it was still there, lying in the same position, its great wings folded closer to its body now than they had been the night before. Its eyes opened when it heard his footsteps. Slow and steady. Watching him the way it had watched him all through the storm. Harold crouched down a few feet away and looked at its wounds in the morning light. They were bad. Worse than he had realized in the dark. The cuts along its sides were deep and long. The torn parts of its wing membrane had dried overnight, but the edges were ragged and raw. There was bruising along its neck, dark patches beneath the scales that told Harold the creature had taken a very hard blow recently. Not from a fall alone. Something had hurt it deliberately. Harold stood up and went inside. He came back with a clean cloth, a bowl of warm water, and a small jar of the thick herbal paste he made every autumn from plants he gathered at the forest edge. He used it on his own cuts and on the chickens when they got injured. He did not know if it would work on something like this creature. But he did not know what else to do. He approached slowly. He always moved slowly around it, no sudden steps, no sudden movements. He had learned that with the fox. He had learned that with every frightened animal he had ever helped. He dipped the cloth in the warm water and began to clean the edges of the nearest wound. The creature went very still. Its golden eyes dropped to watch his hands. Its breathing changed, became shorter for a moment, careful. But it did not pull away. It did not make a sound. Harold worked quietly. He cleaned each wound as gently as he could, rinsing the cloth in the bowl and starting again. When he reached the worst of the cuts, he applied the herbal paste carefully with 2 fingers, spreading it in thin even strokes. The creature flinched once, a small shudder that ran through its entire massive body. Harold paused and waited. Then he continued. It took a long time. When he was done, Harold sat back on his heels and looked at his work. It was not perfect. He was a farmer, not a healer. But the wounds were clean now, and the paste would help. He refilled the water bucket and left a pile of raw vegetables and the last of the salted meat near the creature's head. Then he went to do his morning chores. This became the pattern of the days that followed. Every morning Harold came out to check on the creature. He cleaned its wounds, applied fresh paste, brought water and food. Every evening he did the same. In between he worked his farm, pulling weeds, repairing fences, feeding the chickens, while the creature lay quietly at the side of the barn and watched him move around the yard. Harold talked to it while he worked. He did not plan to. It simply happened. He was a man who had lived alone for a long time, and he had gotten into the habit of speaking his thoughts aloud when no one was there to hear them. So he talked about the weather. About which vegetables were growing well and which were not. About the fence on the north side that needed new posts. About his late wife, Edna, who had planted the apple tree 20 years ago and would have had very strong opinions about a giant winged creature sleeping next to the barn. He did not expect the creature to understand any of it. But it always listened. Its great head would turn slightly toward the sound of his voice. Its golden eyes would settle on him and stay there. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, its ears would shift forward the way a dog's ears shift when it hears something familiar. On the fourth day the villagers came. 3 men and 2 women from the village down the road, walking up the farm path in a tight group with worried faces. Harold met them at the gate. They had heard about the creature. Word had spread fast, it always did in small places. One of them had apparently spotted it from the road and run straight back to tell the others. They told Harold he was being foolish. They told him the creature was dangerous. They told him creatures like that ate livestock and sometimes people. They told him to drive it away before it recovered enough to cause real harm. The oldest of them, a heavy-set man named Gordon, told Harold very seriously that if he did not get rid of it, the village would have no choice but to deal with it themselves. Harold listened to all of it politely. Then he told them the creature was resting on his land and it was not going anywhere until it was well enough to leave on its own. He told them he would be grateful if they did not come up his path again to shout about things they did not understand. Then he opened his gate, waited for them to leave, and closed it again. Gordon looked back twice on the way down the road. Harold did not look back at all. He went back to the creature and checked the paste on its wing where it had dried in the morning sun. 2 days later something changed. Harold was crossing the yard with a basket of tools when the sky went dark. He looked up, expecting clouds. But the sky was clear. The shadow had come from much lower than that. The creature had raised one of its great wings above him. Not fully, it was still too weak for that, but enough. Enough to put Harold in shade. Enough to cover him from the light rain that had begun to fall without him noticing. Harold stopped walking. He looked up at the underside of the enormous wing above him. He could see the places where the tears were healing, thin new skin forming across the gaps, pale against the darker membrane. He could see the long bones of the wing structure spreading out like the frame of something ancient and vast. He looked over at the creature's face. It was watching him. Calm. Still. The golden eyes steady as always. Harold stood there for a moment in the shelter of that great wing with the light rain pattering softly against it from above. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded at things that did not need many words, and continued across the yard. He did not notice the way the wing stayed raised until he reached the other side. Far above, above the clouds, above the wind, above everything Harold could see or imagine, things were not calm at all. The Sky Kingdom stretched across the upper world in great floating formations of stone and cloud and ancient power. There were many kingdoms up there, each ruled by a different winged lord. But above all of them, above every lord and every sky court, there was one ruler. One sovereign. The one who had held the Sky Kingdoms together for longer than most could remember. And that ruler was gone. The Sky Guard had been searching for many days. They had swept every mountain range, every high valley, every known resting ground across the sky territories. They had found nothing. No body. No royal markings. No sign of where their sovereign had fallen or gone. In the sky courts the great winged lords argued loudly about what to do. Some said the sovereign was dead. Some said he had been taken. Some were already beginning to speak about who might take the empty throne. The sky guards searched harder. They did not yet know to look at a small stone farmhouse at the edge of a quiet forest far below the clouds. They did not yet know that their sovereign was sleeping soundly next to a barn, his wounds slowly healing, under the care of a human farmer who talked to him about vegetable gardens and a 20-year-old apple tree. It was a quiet morning when they came. Harold was in the yard pulling weeds from between the vegetable rows when he heard it. Not thunder. Not wind. Something else. A deep rhythmic beat from above, steady and powerful and growing louder with every passing second. He straightened up and looked at the sky. They came through the clouds like falling stones. There were 12 of them. Large winged creatures, smaller than the one resting beside his barn but still enormous by any measure. Each one carried a rider strapped to its back in dark armor that caught the morning light like polished iron. The riders held long weapons, spears with broad silver tips that gleamed as they descended. Their faces were hidden behind closed visors. Their formation was tight and precise. These were not creatures wandering through the sky by accident. These were soldiers. They landed hard in the open field beyond Harold's fence. The ground shook when they hit. The chickens in the barn went loud and frantic. Harold stood in his vegetable patch and watched them without moving. The lead rider dismounted. He was tall, taller than any man Harold had seen, and his armor was heavier than the others, with markings pressed into the chest plate that Harold did not recognize. He pulled off his helmet and tucked it under one arm. His face was sharp and weathered and his eyes moved quickly across the farm, across the barn, across Harold, and back again. He walked to the fence and looked at Harold over the top rail. "Human," he said. His voice was flat and carrying. A voice used to giving orders across great distances. "We have tracked a presence to this location. A large winged creature. You will bring it out now or we will come in and take it." Harold set down his weeding tool slowly. He looked at the 12 armored riders behind the tall soldier. He looked at their spears. He looked at the mounted creatures shifting and stamping behind them, their wings half open and restless. Then he walked across the yard to his side of the fence and stopped there. "This is my land," Harold said. His voice was quiet. Not shaking. Just quiet. "There is a creature resting here," he continued. "It came to me hurt and exhausted and I have been caring for it. It has done nothing wrong on my land and it will not be threatened while it is here." The tall soldier stared at him. A long moment passed. "You are one man," the soldier said slowly. "Unarmed. Standing between us and what we are looking for. Do you understand what you are doing?" "Yes," Harold said simply. Another soldier behind the leader laughed, a short sharp sound. A few others shifted in their saddles. The lead soldier did not laugh. He studied Harold with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite confusion. Something in between. "Step aside," the soldier said. His voice had dropped lower now. A warning in it. Harold did not step aside. He stood at the fence with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes steady on the soldier's face. He was not a young man. His back ached on cold mornings and his hands were rough from decades of farm work. He had no weapon. He had no armor. He had nothing except the fence rail between him and 12 armed soldiers. He did not move. "No creature on my land gets handed over to people with weapons pointed at it," Harold said. "That is not something I am willing to do. You are welcome to turn around and go back the way you came." The lead soldier's jaw tightened. He took one step toward the fence. And then the barn doors moved. It was not a loud sound. Just a slow heavy creak, the sound of something very large pressing against old wood from the inside. Then one door swung open. Then the other. And the creature stepped out. It moved slowly. It was still not fully healed. Its steps were careful and deliberate, and it held one wing slightly lower than the other, the way it had done since the first night. But it was standing. Fully upright for the first time since Harold had found it in the mud. And standing, it was enormous in a way that had not been fully clear when it was lying down. It walked through the barn doors and into the open morning light, and it kept walking, steady and slow, until it stood behind Harold at the fence. Then it stopped. Harold did not turn around. He heard it behind him. He felt the warmth of it, the way the air changed when something that large moved close. But he kept his eyes on the soldiers. He did not need to turn around to know the creature was there. What he did not expect was the silence. One moment there was the sound of restless mounts and shifting armor and the low creak of leather straps. The next moment there was nothing. Complete and total silence across the entire field. Harold looked at the lead soldier's face. The change was instant and absolute. Every trace of authority drained out of that weathered face in a single second. The soldier's eyes had gone past Harold entirely, up and fixed on the creature standing behind him. His mouth had opened slightly. The helmet slipped from under his arm and hit the ground, and he did not reach for it. Harold turned. Every single soldier had dismounted. All 12 of them. On the ground. On their knees. Heads bowed so low their foreheads were nearly touching the earth. Their spears were laid flat on the grass beside them, not dropped in panic, but placed down carefully, deliberately, with both hands. The way you place something down in front of something sacred. Even the mounts had lowered themselves. Great winged creatures that had descended like falling stones now had their heads bowed to the ground, wings spread flat across the grass in a gesture that looked like something between a bow and complete surrender. The lead soldier was on his knees too. His voice when he spoke was entirely different from the one he had used at the fence. That voice had been flat and commanding. This one was shaking. Sovereign, he said. A single word pressed into the ground. Harold looked at the creature. The creature was not looking at the soldiers. It was looking at Harold. Those great golden eyes, the same ones that had watched him bring water on the first stormy night, that had followed his hands as he cleaned wounds each morning, that had stayed steady on him through every quiet day of the past weeks, were looking at him now with the same calm steadiness they always had. But there was something else in them now. Something Harold had not seen before. Something that looked very much like gratitude. Harold stood between 12 kneeling soldiers and the greatest creature he had ever seen, and he did the only thing that made sense to him. He reached back and gently pushed open the fence gate, the one he had kept closed since the soldiers arrived. Not for them. For the creature. So it had room to move if it wanted to. The lead soldier raised his head slowly from the ground and looked at Harold with an expression that no longer had any words in it at all. The silence lasted a long time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 12 soldiers remained on their knees with their heads bowed and their spears flat on the grass. The great winged mounts stayed low with their wings spread wide across the field. Even the wind seemed to have gone quiet, as though the world itself understood that something important was happening in this small corner of it. Harold stood at the open gate and looked at the creature beside him. The creature had not moved either. It stood fully upright in the morning light, its golden eyes still resting on Harold with that same calm and steady expression. Then slowly, very slowly, it turned its great head toward the soldiers in the field. When it spoke, Harold felt the sound in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The voice was deep. Not loud, but deep in a way that seemed to come from somewhere very old. Like the sound of a mountain if a mountain could form words. It was a language Harold did not know. Low rolling sounds that moved through the air like slow water. The creature spoke only a few sentences. Short and clear. Every soldier pressed their foreheads harder to the ground when they heard it. Then the creature turned back to Harold. And it spoke again. But this time the sounds were different. Slower. More careful. Shaped differently in its great mouth. As though it was reaching for something it had not used in a long time. Harold, it said. Harold went very still. His name. Coming from that vast and ancient mouth in a voice like deep stone. Shaped carefully and correctly. Not a guess. Not an accident. It had known his name the entire time. Harold let out a slow breath. You can talk, he said. Yes, the creature said. Just that. One word, carrying the weight of something that had chosen for a long time not to use it. Harold looked at it for a moment. Then he nodded the way he always nodded at things that did not need many words. All right, he said. The lead soldier had raised his head from the ground. His eyes moved between Harold and the creature with an expression of complete disbelief. He seemed to be struggling to understand what he was seeing, the greatest ruler of all the Sky Kingdom standing beside a farm fence talking to a human farmer who had just said all right. The creature looked back at the soldiers. It spoke in their language again, longer this time. Steady and clear, with a weight to every word that made the soldiers straighten slightly even as they stayed on their knees. Then it looked at Harold again. I will tell you what I am telling them, it said in the slow careful words it used for Harold. So that you hear it also. Harold folded his arms and listened. The creature's name was Vaelthur. It did not say this with pride or ceremony. It said it the way a person states a simple fact. Vaelthur was the Sky Sovereign. The ruler above all rulers in the aerial kingdoms that existed above the clouds, above the mountains, above everything that ground-dwelling people could see or reach. He had ruled for longer than the oldest villages below had existed. 3 weeks ago he had been ambushed. A group of rival Sky Lords, lords who wanted the sovereign's throne and had grown tired of waiting for it, had planned the attack carefully over a long time. They had struck in a narrow pass between 2 mountain peaks, far from the sky courts, where Vaelthur had been traveling with only a small escort. The escort had been scattered. Vaelthur had fought and taken wounds he had not taken in centuries. He had managed to break free, but he had been alone and badly hurt and losing strength fast. He had fallen. Not all the way to the ground at once, he had glided as long as he could, following the darkness of the storm that was already moving across the land below. But in the end he had come down in the mud beside a barn at the edge of a forest. And he had lain there with no crown, no markings of rank, no escort, no way to call for help. Just a wounded creature in the dark. And Harold had come around the corner of the barn with a lantern. Vaelthur paused there in the telling. Harold said nothing. He was listening. You did not know what I was, Vaelthur said. You saw only that I was hurt. Yes, Harold said. You brought water. Food. You covered me against the cold. The great golden eyes were steady on Harold's face. Every morning and every evening you came. You cleaned my wounds with your own hands. You spoke to me. You stood at your fence against armed soldiers to keep me safe. Harold shifted slightly. Anyone would have done the same. Vaelthur was quiet for a moment. No, he said. They would not. Harold opened his mouth and then closed it again. He did not argue. He could hear in that single word that it was not a guess. It was something Vaelthur knew from a very long life of watching the world from above. Vaelthur turned back to his soldiers. He spoke at length now. The soldiers were all upright on their knees, heads still lowered but eyes raised, listening to every word with absolute attention. As Vaelthur spoke, some of them glanced at Harold. Quick, careful glances, the kind given to someone who has just been placed in a category that changes everything. The lead soldier's expression had changed completely from what it had been at the fence. There was no more authority in it. No more flatness. It had been replaced by something that sat between deep shame and deep respect, and Harold could not tell which one was stronger. When Vaelthur finished speaking, the lead soldier pressed both fists to the ground and bowed so low his armor touched the grass. Harold looked at Vaelthur. What did you tell them? He asked. Vaelthur turned to him. I told them the truth of what happened, he said. I told them you sheltered me when I had nothing. No crown. No power. No name that meant anything to you. I told them you treated me with full dignity when there was no reason for you to do so and nothing for you to gain from it. Harold said nothing. And I told them, Vaelthur continued, that from this day you are to be accorded the highest honor ever given to a ground dweller in the history of the Sky Kingdoms. That every soldier, every lord, every court above the clouds is to know your name and know what you did. Harold looked out at the 12 soldiers still kneeling in his field. He was quiet for a long moment. I didn't do it for honor, he said. I know, Vaelthur said. I did it because you were hurt and it was raining. I know that also, Vaelthur said. That is precisely why. Harold looked at him. The great golden eyes were warm in a way they had not been on that first stormy night, or perhaps they had always been warm and Harold had simply not known what he was looking at. The lead soldier raised his head from the ground and for the first time spoke directly to Harold. His voice was rough and careful. Forgive us, he said. For what we said at the fence. Harold looked at him for a moment. Already forgotten, Harold said simply. The soldier stared at him. Then he lowered his head again, not because he was commanded to but because he chose to. The morning had grown bright by the time the soldiers rose from their knees. They did not rise until Vaelthur spoke to them again, a short quiet word that Harold did not understand but which clearly meant they were permitted to stand. They got to their feet slowly and carefully, the way people stand after something has changed them. Their spears stayed on the ground. None of them reached for them. None of them looked like soldiers who had come to take something anymore. They looked like people who had been shown something they had not expected to see and were still working out what to do with it. The lead soldier stood with his helmet still on the ground at his feet and his eyes lowered. Vaelthur looked at Harold. The morning light was full on both of them now. On Harold in his plain farm clothes with dirt still on his hands from the weeding he had been doing when all this began, and on Vaelthur standing tall with his great wings folded and his golden eyes quiet. I will return to my kingdom soon, Vaelthur said. My wounds are healed enough for the journey. My soldiers will escort me back. Harold nodded. Good, he said. The wing gave you trouble. The left one. Make sure you rest it properly before you push it too hard. Vaelthur looked at him for a moment. Something moved in those ancient golden eyes that was very close to warmth. I will, he said. A pause settled between them. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind of pause that sits between two people who have said most of what matters and are simply letting it rest. Then Vaelthur spoke again. "I want to give you something before I go," he said. "A reward. It is the right of any sovereign to give reward to one who has shown great service. You have shown greater service than most who have ever stood in my courts." Harold shook his head slightly. "You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to," Vaelthur said. "I want to. Name what you wish. Land. Wealth. A place of honor in the sky courts. Protection for yourself alone for as long as you live. Name it and it is yours." Harold was quiet. He looked out at the field where the soldiers stood. He looked at the forest beyond his fence, the dark line of trees where he sometimes heard wolves at night, where deer came to the edge at dawn, where the village children were told not to go too deep because of the things that lived in the high branches and the shadows. He looked back at Vaelthur. "There is one thing," Harold said. "Name it," Vaelthur said. "The village down the road," Harold said. "The people there. They are simple people. Farmers and craftsmen. They do not have walls or weapons worth speaking of." He paused. "And the forest. The animals in it. The deer and the foxes and the rest of them. They have done nothing to deserve being hunted from above." Vaelthur listened without interrupting. "Leave them alone," Harold said. "All of them. The village and the forest both. No sky creature comes down on them. No hunting. No frightening them in the night. Leave them in peace." He said it plainly. Not as a demand. Not with any heat behind it. Just clearly and directly the way he said most things. Vaelthur was still for a moment. Then he said, "That is what you ask for yourself." "It is not for myself," Harold said. "It is for them." Vaelthur looked at him for a long time. The golden eyes moved across Harold's face with the careful attention of someone reading something written in a language they have known for a very long time and are seeing a new word in for the first time. "Done," Vaelthur said. "No ceremony. No long speech. Just that one word, spoken with the full weight of a sovereign's authority behind it. In the sky kingdoms, when the sovereign said done, it was done. It would be carried to every sky court, recorded in every sky record, binding on every winged lord from that day forward." The lead soldier heard it and pressed his fist to his chest. Harold nodded. "Thank you." "Now," Vaelthur said. "I will give you something else as well. Not instead of your request. In addition to it." Harold began to say that was not necessary, but Vaelthur had already raised one great wing and extended the tip of it toward the stone wall of Harold's barn. The tip of the wing, the long curved point at the end, began to glow. A slow deep gold, like the last light before sunset. Vaelthur pressed it carefully against the stone. Where it touched, something appeared. It was a mark pressed into the stone itself. Not painted. Not scratched. Pressed into the surface the way a seal is pressed into warm wax, permanent and clean and deep. It was circular, with a pattern inside that Harold could not fully make out at this distance, but which seemed to shift slightly when the light moved across it, the way still water shifts when something breathes near it. Vaelthur lowered his wing. "The sovereign seal," he said. "Every sky creature in every kingdom knows this mark. It means this land and all who live near it are under the permanent protection of the sky kingdoms. No harm will come from above. Not to your farm. Not to your village. Not to your forest." He paused. "Not ever." Harold looked at the mark on his barn wall. It was a quiet and simple thing to look at. Not large. Not bright in the full morning sun. But it sat in the stone with a kind of certainty that made Harold feel it would still be there long after the barn itself had fallen. He put his hand on it once. Then he turned back to Vaelthur. "I think this calls for tea," Harold said. "If you drink it." Vailthur looked at him. "I do not drink tea," he said. "Fair enough," Harold said. Something shifted in Vailthur's face then, a movement around the great mouth that Harold had not seen before. It took him a moment to understand what it was. Vailthur was smiling. The preparations for departure did not take long. The soldiers gathered themselves quietly and mounted their winged creatures with none of the sharp efficiency they had shown on arrival. They moved carefully now. Deliberately. With a kind of respect in every small action that had not been there when they landed. The lead soldier stopped before Harold as he passed the gate. He looked at Harold for a moment without speaking. Then he reached up and removed something from around his neck. A small flat piece of dark metal on a cord, stamped with a mark that matched the one now pressed into Harold's barn wall. He held it out. "So that any sky soldier who sees you knows immediately who you are," the soldier said quietly. "And what you are owed." Harold took it. He looked at it once and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. The soldier nodded and walked to his mount. Vailthur stood before Harold last. They looked at each other in the full morning light. The great sky sovereign and the quiet farmer, without any need to fill the moment with more words than it required. "You are a good man, Harold," Vailthur said. "You are a good creature," Harold said. "Whatever you are." The warmth in the golden eyes deepened. Then Vailthur spread his great wings, both of them, fully, for the first time since Harold had found him broken in the mud, and the span of them was so wide that they threw half the farm into shadow. Harold felt the rush of air as those wings came down in one powerful stroke. Then another. Then Vailthur was rising, slowly at first, then faster, his great body lifting into the blue morning sky with a grace that Harold had not seen before and knew he would not forget. The soldiers rose with him. 12 winged shapes climbing in tight formation around their sovereign. Harold stood at his fence and watched them go. The villagers had gathered at the bottom of the road. Gordon was among them, his mouth open, his eyes fixed on the sky. The village children stood very still in a way that children only stand when they are seeing something they will remember their whole lives. Vailthur and the sky guard rose higher. Smaller. Until they were shapes against the blue. Until they were specks. Until they were gone into the white of the high clouds and the sky was empty and quiet again. Harold stood at his fence a moment longer. Then he picked up his weeding tool from where he had left it on the ground and walked back to his vegetable rows. He had work to do. In the sky kingdoms above the clouds the story spread fast. From court to court. From lord to lord. From soldier to soldier who had heard it from the 12 who had been there and knelt in a farmer's field. The story of the sovereign who fell. The human who found him. The water and the food and the blankets. The fence. The unarmed man who stood between armed soldiers and a creature resting on his land. And from that story came the saying. Nobody decided on it. It simply appeared the way true sayings always appear, rising naturally out of something that happened and refusing to go away. It spread across every sky kingdom above the clouds. It was spoken in the great courts and in the small ones. It was said by lords and by soldiers and by young winged creatures who had not yet learned to fly. Even a sovereign remembers who held open the door. And far below all of it, in a quiet farm at the edge of a wide forest, Harold pulled weeds from between his vegetable rows in the bright morning sun, with a small mark pressed into his barn wall that shone faintly gold when the light moved across it just right. He did not think of himself as someone who had done anything remarkable. He had simply done what needed doing. That was all. That had always been enough.